Hi everyone, in this video we're going to wrap up our discussion of lipids. So we're very briefly going to cover waxes, and we'll also talk about cell membranes and how lipids fit into cell membranes, and then we'll also talk about steroids. So let's start with waxes. This is going to be pretty short, but waxes are esters of fatty acids and long chain alcohols, which will usually have 12 to 32 carbons in them. So down below is an example of an ester that is a wax. So we've got our portion from an alcohol here, and we have our portion from the fatty acid. So we've talked about making esters in the past, and remember it involves a carboxylic acid and an alcohol. So that's called esterification. So in this case, the fatty acid is coming from palmitic acid, which was a carboxylic acid. Now, waxes are not soluble in water, and if you've ever burned a candle, for instance, you know that candle wax does not dissolve in water very easily. But additionally, waxes are not easily hydrolyzed, so you can't break them apart as easily. So waxes are often found in protective coatings. They're also used commercially to make cosmetics, candles, ointments, and protective polishes. So the main thing to know about waxes is that they contain a long chain fatty acid that's then connected to a long chain alcohol. All right, next I wanted to talk about how important lipids are in cell membranes. So in our bodies, we have a lot of different cells, and our cells are made up of a membrane that protects everything inside the cell. Although that membrane can also let things pass through if needed. So most membranes are composed of 60% lipid and 40% protein. And we'll talk more about proteins in a later chapter. So the lipids that are in these cell membranes are actually phosphoglycerides. We kind of skipped phosphoglycerides here, but the main idea is that we've got a polar end and then a non-polar end. So these lipids are organized in what's called a lipid bilayer with those hydrophobic tails that are inside, and then the polar ends point outside. So actually, this ends up kind of wrapping around into a circle with the other end. So it's not, this is just a portion, I guess, of the cell membrane. All right. So membrane lipids usually contain unsaturated fatty acid chains. So those are the ones that had bends and kinks in them. So that means that they're going to fit into the bilayers more loosely than saturated fatty acids. So that helps to increase the flexibility or the fluidity of the membrane because we don't have entirely, saturated fatty acids or the straight chain fatty acids. So which is good because we don't want solids floating around too much in our bodies. We want things to be somewhat loose so that, stuff can flow in and out of our cells. Now there's also proteins in the lipid bilayer, and they kind of look like icebergs coming out of the sea. So we'll see a picture of that in a second. Now, lipid molecules are free to move within the bilayer, kind of like dancers on a crowded dance floor. So they can kind of move throughout the membrane. So let's kind of look at what that might look like here. So we've got our lipid membrane. So this is coming from just a portion of our cell membrane. So normally this would be entirely enclosed. But we're just kind of cutting out a portion of the membrane just to look at it a little bit closer. All right, so we've got our polar heads and our non-polar tails here for the membrane. And we've got the cell exterior up above, and then the cell interior down below, which we also call cytoplasm. So you'll notice that there's a cholesterol molecule here, which you might have heard of before. We'll talk about cholesterol more in a minute because it is a type of steroid. So this is a type of lipid. And again, these can kind of meander their way through the membrane and just kind of move around the membrane. Also notice that some of these fatty acid chains have kinks in them. And again, that's why the membrane is so fluid, because it's not rigidly stuck together. We've got these kinks and bends that are keeping the structure more liquid or more fluid, which is a good thing. Now, we've also got these carbohydrates that are kind of sticking up above the cell membrane. So that's from our previous section, chapter 17. And then we have these proteins that are also making up the cell membrane. And these proteins are really important for helping things pass through the lipid bilayer. So for instance, you could have ions go through one way, maybe they go back through. So these are very important key parts of the lipid bilayer as well, or the cell membrane, I should say. All right. Now that we've kind of talked about the importance of lipids within a cell membrane, let's talk about our last category of lipids, steroids. So steroids are a very broad class of compounds, but they all have the same structural feature, which is 3 6-membered rings that are all connected in this manner here. So we've got one here, the second one here, and then the third one kind of up above. And then we have a 5-membered ring attached to the right. Now, the way that they become different is based on the groups that are attached. So you might have a ketone, an alcohol, carboxylic acid, maybe there's a double bond somewhere, and that's what creates our different steroid molecules. So like all lipids, steroids are only soluble in non-polar solvents. Now, cholesterol is actually the most abundant steroid in the human body. And remember, in that cell membrane, we had a few cholesterol molecules throughout the lipid bilayer. So cholesterol is an essential component of cell membranes, and it's a precursor of other important steroids. So cholesterol is synthesized by our liver, and it's present in many foods as well. There is a strong correlation between cholesterol blood levels and the hardening of our arteries, atherosclerosis. So down below you can see the structure of cholesterol. So again, this has an alcohol group, a couple of methyl groups, a double bond here, an alkene, and then we've got this long carbon chain at the top with a couple of branches coming off. So this is definitely a steroid because of the ring system that exists, but what makes it different from other steroids are all of those different groups that are bonded to it. Another important steroid is bile. So we probably don't enjoy bile. Usually it's coming out, but bile is important in our biology. It's this yellowish brown or green kind of liquid that's produced by the liver, and then it's stored in the gallbladder and emptied into the intestine. So the reason bile is important is that it emulsifies lipids in the intestine by breaking them apart, or breaking apart what are called lipid globules. So once those lipid globules are broken apart, there's more surface area, and that will allow the lipids to be more easily digested or hydrolyzed. So fats and oils, for instance. So we have an example of a bile salt down below. So we've got some alcohols here, a couple methyl groups, another alcohol, and then this really long amide chain. So this is an amide, note the nitrogen there, and the carbonyl group. And this is what helps to break apart lipids from each other so that we can then hydrolyze them. Now, other steroids that are very important in our biology are hormones. So a hormone is a chemical messenger, and it's secreted by specific glands and carried through the blood to a target tissue. And that's where it will trigger a particular response. So there are two major categories of steroid hormones. There's adrenocorticoid hormones and sex hormones. So on the left, we have cortisol, which is an adrenocorticoid hormone. You might have heard of this as the stress hormone. Even though cortisol can be a bad thing in large amounts, it can also be a good thing in moderate amounts. So we do need cortisol at a certain level, but if it kind of exceeds that level, then it can become a bad thing. But cortisol does help in a lot of ways. For instance, it's an anti-inflammatory. It can also help us sort of keep certain nutrients that we need to survive, etc. So, cortisol isn't always bad. Although I know during the pandemic I had a lot of cortisol, so I'm trying to lower those levels now. I'm sure all of you are as well. And then estradiol is an example of a sex hormone. And notice that estradiol is actually aromatic. It has a benzene ring in it. And then it also has, a couple alcohols here, a methyl group. So it's a little simpler than some of the other steroids that we've looked at. But again, these are all lipids. So it's kind of crazy that lipids are, covering such a broad range of molecules. So let's look at some other sex hormones as well. So there are male sex hormones that are produced by testes, including testosterone. So that's shown here. And that actually looks pretty similar to estradiol that we saw earlier. And then estrogen and progesterone are female sex hormones that are produced by ovaries. So this includes estradiol and estrone. And then progesterone is shown as well. So these all look pretty similar to each other. They're not that different, but they make a huge difference in our biology. All right, so that was all I had for steroids. So that wraps up this section. So we covered chapter 17 and chapter 18, carbohydrates and lipids. If you do have any questions about this content, please let me know. You can message me through Canvas, through email. You can ask questions on the discussion board, or you can set up a one-on-one appointment through the Calendly link on Canvas. All right, good luck.